What if your wedding day was cancelled for a reason you could not even fathom? What if the vows were never spoken? Not because of cold feet, but because of a discovery that rocked the very foundations of medieval society. From the bustling streets of 12th century London to the grand castles of 15th century France, people faced shocking truths that halted their journeys to the altar. Number 12. A dark past revealed. The unsuitable secret. In the medieval world, a betrothal was a serious promise, often as binding as marriage itself. Yet sometimes hidden truths from a person's past could unravel even the most carefully planned alliances, leading to the abrupt cancellation of a wedding. This was not about a lover's quarrel or a sudden change of heart. It was about the exposure of a deep-seated secret, often one that threatened the family's honor, the purity of the lineage, or the very validity of the union in the eyes of God and man. Such secrets might include a history of severe mental illness, a past act of violence that was never punished, or a scandalous reputation that had been carefully concealed. The discovery of a major impediment to a valid marriage, something that fundamentally questioned the character or suitability of one of the parties, could bring down the grandest wedding plans. Take, for instance, the case from the late 14th century, involving the proposed union between Lady Isobel de Montfort and Sir Thomas Beaumont. Lady Isobel was a young woman of impeccable breeding, her family rooted deeply in the ancient soil of the Midlands. Sir Thomas was a rising star in the king's court, his family's fortunes steadily growing. Their betrothal had been arranged with great care, promises exchanged, and a substantial dowry settled. The wedding was set for the summer, a grand affair planned for the Beaumont family's estate. However, whispers began to reach the ears of Lady Isobel's father, Sir Reginald. These were not the usual courtly gossip, but dark murmurs concerning Sir Thomas's early life. It was suggested that in his youth, during a period of service to a distant lord, Sir Thomas had been involved in a grave incident, a matter of violence that had left a permanent stain on his character. The details were vague at first, hushed tones behind closed doors, but persistent. Sir Reginald, a man of stern principles and deep concern for his family's reputation, could not ignore these rumors. He dispatched trusted servants, men skilled in quiet investigation, to the distant lands where Sir Thomas had spent his formative years. What they uncovered was chilling. It appeared that Sir Thomas, in a fit of youthful rage and perhaps fueled by strong drink, had committed a violent act that led to the severe injury of a peasant, leaving the man permanently disabled. The matter had been covered up by his then lord, who wished to avoid scandal, and Sir Thomas had moved on, his past seemingly buried. However, the victim and his family had never forgotten, and the story, though suppressed, continued to exist in the local memory. The severity of the act, the lack of immediate justice, and the fact that it had been deliberately hidden were profound issues. For a knight, a man sworn to uphold justice and protect the innocent, such a blemish was not merely a youthful mistake. It reflected a dangerous capacity for lawlessness and a lack of moral compass. Upon receiving the full report, Sir Reginald was distraught. To marry his daughter to a man with such a secret past, especially one involving unpunished violence, would be an unacceptable risk. It would not only endanger Isobel's future happiness and safety, but it would also cast a dark shadow over the Montfort name. The family's prestige, built over centuries, could be undermined by a union with someone of questionable integrity. The matter was discussed at length within the family council. The decision was not easy. Breaking a betrothal, even for valid reasons, could lead to financial penalties and social awkwardness. However, the alternative, marrying Isobel to a man with such a documented and concealed history of violence, was deemed far worse. Sir Reginald sent a formal delegation to the Beaumont family, bearing the grave news and the evidence. The Beaumonts, initially outraged, were eventually forced to acknowledge the truth of the accusations. The wedding was called off, The betrothal formally dissolved, and the dowry returned. Lady Isobel, though initially confused and saddened, eventually understood the gravity of her father's decision, knowing that a potentially dangerous future had been averted by the revelation of a dark, unsuitable secret. Public explanation was vague, citing unforeseen impediments to the union, but within courtly circles the truth, or at least a version of it, gradually surfaced, reinforcing the idea that even the highest born could not escape the shadow of a hidden past. Number 11. Heretic Horrors, Uncovering a Soul Lost to the Church. In an age deeply devoted to the Church, where spiritual beliefs permeated every aspect of life, to be labeled a heretic was a fate worse than death for many. The very idea of marrying someone who strayed from the true doctrines of the faith was an unthinkable affront, not just to one's own soul, but to God Himself. The discovery that a prospective bride or groom harbored heretical beliefs, or was secretly a follower of a condemned sect, would instantly unravel any marriage plans regardless of wealth, status, or prior arrangements. This was not a matter of simple disagreement, it was a matter of eternal damnation, and no family would willingly bind itself to such a spiritual peril. The Church's influence was absolute in these matters, and its laws were clear. No union could be valid with a known enemy of the faith. Consider the unsettling tale of Eleanor of Wroxham, a young woman of gentle birth from a prominent family in Norfolk, and Robert Fitzwilliam, a respected knight from a neighboring shire in the early 13th century. Their families had long been friends, and their union was seen as a natural culmination of their shared history and growing prosperity. Eleanor was known for her piety, her regular attendance at Mass, and her devotion to the saints. Robert was equally outwardly pious, a man who contributed generously to local monasteries and seemed to embody the chivalric ideals of his time. The betrothal had been agreed upon, and the preparations for a large wedding were well underway. The local bishop was even expected to officiate, a sign of the family's importance. However, a chilling accusation began to circulate, not against Robert directly, but concerning whispers heard from his household staff and even distant acquaintances. It was suggested that Robert, during his travels on the continent, had come into contact with certain individuals who espoused doctrines dangerously close to Catharism, a dualistic religious movement that the Church vehemently condemned as heresy. Cathars, particularly prevalent in parts of southern France, held beliefs that diverged sharply from Orthodox Catholic teachings, including views on the nature of God, the role of the Church, and the sacraments. They were persecuted relentlessly by the Church, their followers often burned at the stake. Initially, the rumors were dismissed as malicious gossip, perhaps fueled by jealous rivals who envied Robert's rising standing. Persistence of the claims and the increasing specificity of the alleged heresies compelled Eleanor's father, Lord Wroxham, to take the matter seriously. Quietly began to make inquiries, using his network of connections, including certain well-placed monks and even a trusted inquisitor known for his discretion. The investigation uncovered disturbing evidence. It appeared that Robert, indeed, had spent time in regions known for Cathar activity. More damningly, certain passages from letters he had exchanged with known Cathar sympathizers were intercepted. These letters, though carefully veiled, hinted at a rejection of certain Catholic sacraments, a questioning of the established church hierarchy, and an adherence to a more ascetic, less dogmatic interpretation of Christianity that strongly mirrored Cathar teachings. One letter in particular discussed the corruptness of the earthly church and the purity of the spirit, phrases commonly associated with the condemned sect. The Inquisitor's report, though confidential, painted a clear, albeit unsettling picture. Robert Fitzwilliam, despite his outward conformity, held views that were unequivocally heretical in the eyes of the Church. He might not have openly preached these doctrines, but his private beliefs were damning. The discovery was a profound shock to Lord Wroxham and his family. To allow Eleanor to marry a man who secretly harbored heretical beliefs would be to risk not only her spiritual well-being, but also the family's standing with the Church and the king. Such a union could lead to the confiscation of lands, the excommunication of the family, and eternal damnation. The decision was swift and agonizing. The betrothal was immediately broken. The wedding was cancelled, and a formal explanation was given to the church authorities, outlining the reasons for the dissolution. Robert Fitzwilliam was quietly admonished, and though not immediately subjected to public inquisition due to his family's power, his reputation was irrevocably damaged, and he soon found himself ostracized from courtly circles. Eleanor, though heartbroken, understood the gravity of the situation. Her future had been saved from a spiritual abyss. Her family's honor protected from the dreaded shadow of heresy. Number 10. The Royal Reroute. When politics trump true love. For the powerful families of the medieval era, especially royalty and the highest nobility, marriage was rarely about personal affection. It was a tool, a strategic alliance forged to consolidate power, secure borders, gain territories, or create formidable dynastic blocks. Betrothals, even between young children, were meticulously arranged years in advance, often involving intricate treaties and substantial dowries. However, the political landscape of medieval Europe was a turbulent sea, constantly shifting with wars, deaths, new alliances, and unexpected turns of fortune. What seemed like a perfect match one day could become a dangerous liability the next, leading to the abrupt and often brutal cancellation of a grand wedding for reasons of state. Personal feelings of the individuals involved were almost entirely secondary to the greater good of the realm or the dynasty. A famous example of this brutal reality occurred in the mid-15th century, concerning the proposed marriage between young Prince Edward of England, son of King Henry VI, and the infant Princess Yolande, daughter of King René of Anjou and Lorraine. This alliance was part of a larger diplomatic effort to strengthen England's position against France during the 100 Years' War and secure various claims. The families had exchanged emissaries, discussed the terms of the marriage contract, and gifts were exchanged. The betrothal was seen as a significant step towards securing a lasting peace and a powerful alliance between the two royal houses. For the English, it offered a valuable connection to territories on the continent and potential support for their ongoing claims. For the Angevins, it promised royal prestige and a powerful protector. However, the political winds were unpredictable and swift. At the very moment the formal betrothal was being celebrated and preparations for the eventual marriage were being made, a monumental shift occurred in England. The Wars of the Roses, an internal conflict for the English crown between the houses of Lancaster and York, erupted with renewed ferocity. King Henry VI, Edward's father, faced increasing challenges to his rule. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, a formidable woman and a key political player, found herself increasingly isolated and desperate for stronger support. The alliance with René of Anjou, though still desirable in some respects, was not sufficient to secure the Lancastrian throne against the rising power of the Yorkists. The immediate need was not for a long-term continental alliance, but for swift, decisive military aid. To secure this aid, Queen Margaret of Anjou made a stunning and controversial move. She decided to forge a new alliance with the most unlikely of partners, her family's traditional enemy, the powerful French king, Louis XI, and, crucially, the influential Earl of Warwick, who had recently defected from the Yorkist cause. To solidify this new, desperate alliance, Margaret agreed to betroth her son, Prince Edward, not to Princess Yolande of Anjou, but to Anne Neville, Warwick's younger daughter. This decision was a pure act of political pragmatism. The proposed union with Anne Neville promised immediate military support from Warwick and a powerful French alliance, something that the betrothal to Princess Yolande, while still strategically sound in a broader sense, could not offer in the immediate crisis. The needs of the Lancastrian cause, the desperate struggle for the throne, overshadowed all previous agreements. The betrothal to Princess Yolande was abruptly and unceremoniously dissolved. The diplomatic niceties were observed, but the reality was stark. A royal marriage plan, years in the making, was scrapped for a more pressing political necessity. There was no real room for negotiation or sentimentality. King and queen, fighting for their very survival, could not afford to prioritize a future alliance over an immediate lifeline. Prince Edward and Princess Yolande, both mere pawns in the grand game of thrones, had their futures dramatically rerouted by forces entirely beyond their control. The wedding was called off, not due to personal failings or hidden secrets, but because the very foundation of the alliance, the political bedrock upon which it rested, had crumbled and shifted, demanding a new strategic maneuver in the ruthless chess game of medieval power. Number 9. The dowry dbal. When the money's missing and the status doesn't match. In the medieval world, marriage was very much an economic transaction. Crucial part of any noble or wealthy commoner's marriage agreement was the dowry, a substantial sum of money, goods or land that the bride's family provided to the groom's family upon the marriage. This dowry was intended to help support the wife and her children, often reverting to her or her heirs if she outlived her husband. But it also served as a significant economic contribution to the groom's family. For the groom's family, the dowry was a major factor in assessing the desirability of a bride. If the promised dowry was not delivered, or if there was a misrepresentation of wealth or status, the entire arrangement could crumble, leading to the abrupt cancellation of the wedding. Such a situation was not merely an inconvenience. It was a breach of contract that could carry serious financial and social repercussions. Yet the financial stakes were often too high to proceed without the promised sum. Consider the regrettable case from the early 14th century involving Sir Godfrey de Beaumont and Lady Matilda of Sussex. Sir Godfrey, a minor nobleman with aspirations, sought to marry into a wealthier, more established family to bolster his own fortunes. Lady Matilda's family, the de Clarens, possessed vast estates and considerable wealth, though their exact financial standing was sometimes debated. A marriage between their houses was meticulously negotiated, and the centerpiece of these negotiations was the dowry. Lady Matilda's father, Lord de Clarens, a man known for his grand promises and sometimes less grand deliveries, had pledged a staggering sum of gold, a substantial tract of prime agricultural land, and a valuable collection of jewels as his daughter's dowry. Sir Godfrey and his family were impressed by the proposed wealth, seeing it as a gutting infusion into their own more modest holdings. The betrothal was celebrated, and the wedding date was set. As the wedding day approached, Sir Godfrey's family began to press for the formal transfer of the dowry, as was customary before the ceremony itself. Lord de Clarens, however, started to prevaricate. He cited unexpected financial difficulties, delayed payments from tenants, and even a sudden illness that prevented him from attending to the matter. The initial delays were tolerated, but as the wedding day drew nearer, the excuses grew thinner, and the promised sums failed to materialize. The land transfer documents were incomplete. The jewels were nowhere to be seen, and the gold which was meant to be counted and formally received remained a phantom sum. Sir Godfrey's family grew increasingly anxious. Their calculations for improving their estates, for investing in new ventures, and for securing their own financial future all hinged on the arrival of this promised wealth. Without it, the marriage, from a pragmatic point of view, lost much of its appeal. Further investigation by Sir Godfrey's meticulous financial advisors revealed an even more unsettling truth. It appeared that Lord de Clarens's wealth, while substantial on paper, was heavily encumbered by debts and loans. His reputation for grand living had outstripped his actual liquid assets, and the lands he promised as dowry were entangled in complex legal disputes and mortgages. The value of the proposed dowry was not what had been represented, and the ability of Lord de Clarens to deliver on his pledges was severely compromised. The true status of the de Clarens family, though still respected, was not quite as secure or as wealthy as had been portrayed. The discrepancy was too significant to ignore. For Sir Godfrey and his family, proceeding with the marriage without the promised dowry would be a financial disaster. It would mean taking on a bride without the expected economic contribution, potentially burdening their own family with her upkeep, without the means to do so. It would also set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that their family could be easily manipulated. The decision was made to call off the wedding. A formal notice was sent to Lord de Clarence, stating that the terms of the agreement had not been met. While Lord de Clarence protested, claiming temporary setbacks, the evidence of his true financial state and his failure to deliver on his promises was undeniable. The wedding was cancelled, and the families endured a period of awkwardness and resentment. Lady Matilda, though innocent in the matter, found her future jeopardized by her father's grand promises and inability to meet them, serving as a stark reminder that in the medieval age, a marriage was often a contract that stood or fell on the precise fulfillment of its financial terms. Number 8. The hidden ailment that cancelled everything. Sickness and secret afflictions. While medieval society did not have the sophisticated medical understanding of later eras, certain physical conditions were recognized as significant impediments to marriage, particularly if they were debilitating, incurable, or deemed to carry a social stigma. The discovery of a serious hidden ailment or a profound physical deformity in one of the betrothed parties, especially one that had been concealed, could lead to the cancellation of a wedding. This was often rooted in concerns about the ability to bear children, the capacity to perform marital duties, or the fear of hereditary diseases. If such an affliction was discovered after the betrothal but before the wedding, it could be argued that the contract was based on fraudulent representation or that a fundamental change in circumstances rendered the union impossible or undesirable. Take the poignant case from the late 12th century involving the proposed marriage between young Baron Julian of Normandy and Lady Eleanor of Brittany. Their families were forging an important cross-channel alliance, and the union of their children was seen as a key step in securing peace and mutual prosperity. Julian was a robust, promising young man, and Eleanor was known for her beauty and gentle disposition. The negotiations had been extensive, the dowry settled, and the wedding was only weeks away, planned for the spring season. However, as the time for the formal transfer of Lady Eleanor to Baron Julian's household for the final preparations approached, a disturbing secret began to surface. It concerned Eleanor's elder brother, a man who had for many years been kept largely secluded from public view. Whispers of a strange, debilitating illness that afflicted him had circulated, but they were vague and often attributed to youthful indiscretion or a melancholic temperament. Now, as the prospect of the marriage solidified, more precise and alarming information emerged. It was revealed that Eleanor's brother suffered from what was then described as the falling sickness or epilepsy, a condition that was poorly understood in the medieval era. It was often viewed with suspicion, sometimes even associated with demonic possession or divine punishment. More critically, there was a growing fear, unsupported by modern science, but deeply ingrained in medieval belief, that such conditions could be hereditary. The full extent of the affliction, including the brother's increasing seizures and mental decline, was brought to the attention of Baron Julian's family by an anonymous but well-informed source. The source, perhaps a disgruntled servant or a rival family, provided detailed accounts of the brother's condition, highlighting the severe nature of the illness and the attempts by Lady Eleanor's family to keep it a profound secret, rarely allowing him to be seen in public. The discovery was deeply troubling for Baron Julian's parents. Their primary concern was the continuation of their lineage, the birth of healthy heirs to carry on their name and inherit their lands. The fear that Eleanor might carry the same predisposition, or that her children might inherit this dreaded falling sickness, was a terrifying prospect. In an age where medical knowledge was limited, such fears, even if unscientific, were powerful enough to undermine any marital arrangement. The implications were also social. A family associated with a known illness, particularly one viewed with such apprehension, could face a decline in prestige and difficulty in securing future advantageous matches for their children. The concealment of the illness was also seen as a form of deceit, undermining the trust that was so vital in such a significant alliance. Baron Julian's family convened a council. After much deliberation, they made the difficult decision to call off the wedding. They sent a formal communication to Lady Eleanor's family, citing the discovery of a grave and undisclosed impediment that made the union impossible. While they did not publicly state the specific illness, the implication was clear, and the cancellation sent ripples of gossip through the noble houses of both Normandy and Brittany. Lady Eleanor, though innocent and perfectly healthy herself, bore the brunt of her family's desperate attempt to conceal a painful secret, as the revelation of a hidden ailment proved too significant an obstacle for her grand wedding to proceed. Number 7. God's Calling versus Your Wedding Bells. The Cloister Cutoff. In a deeply religious society, the call to monastic life, to dedicate oneself entirely to God, was considered the highest spiritual path. A person who genuinely felt called to enter a monastery or convent, even if already betrothed, could seek to dissolve their engagement and pursue a life of religious devotion. The Church, which upheld the sanctity of vows to God above all earthly promises, generally supported such decisions. If one party to a betrothal decided to take solemn religious vows, the wedding would be called off and the engagement annulled, as the individual was now considered married to Christ or the Church. This was not a frivolous excuse, but a profound spiritual commitment, and to stand in its way was to oppose divine will. Consider the unusual case from the mid-13th century, involving young Seraphina of Kent and Lord Richard of Wessex. Their betrothal had been arranged since their early childhood, a strategic alliance between two powerful Kentish families. Seraphina was a gentle, introspective girl, known for her piety and her love of spiritual texts. Richard was a practical, worldly young lord, eager to take on the responsibilities of his estates as they both approached maturity. The wedding date was set. Seraphina, though outwardly compliant with the wishes of her family, had for many years felt a growing spiritual yearning, a deep desire to dedicate her life to prayer and contemplation, far from the trappings of worldly power and domesticity. This yearning grew more intense. As the wedding preparations advanced, she spent hours in the local convent, speaking with the abbess, participating in the daily rituals, and feeling a profound sense of peace and belonging within its quiet walls. Thought of a life of marriage, though honorable, felt increasingly restrictive and distant from her true calling. She knew that breaking the betrothal would cause immense distress to her family and to Lord Richard's, but her conviction that God was calling her to a religious life became so overwhelming that she felt she could not ignore it. Finally, with immense courage and a heavy heart, Seraphina approached her parents. She declared her unwavering intention to enter the local Benedictine convent and take the veil, explaining that she felt an irresistible divine calling that superseded her earthly commitments. Her parents were understandably dismayed and even angry. They had invested considerable time, effort, and resources into arranging this advantageous match. Lord Richard's family would be furious. The social implications of such a rejection would be significant. They tried to dissuade her, to remind her of her duties to her family, her future children, and the security that marriage to Lord Richard would bring. However, Seraphina remained steadfast. Her conviction was absolute, and she was prepared to endure any familial displeasure to follow what she believed was God's will. Knowing that they could not force her into a marriage she felt religiously bound to avoid, and facing the potential for divine displeasure or spiritual scandal if they were perceived to be thwarting a genuine religious vocation, her parents reluctantly agreed to seek formal dissolution of the betrothal. The matter was brought before the local bishop who, after interviewing Seraphina at length and verifying the sincerity of her spiritual calling, confirmed that her genuine desire to enter religious life was a valid impediment to her marriage. Canon law upheld the right of an individual to pursue a religious vocation, even if it meant dissolving a pre-existing betrothal. The wedding was officially called off. Lord Richard and his family were understandably displeased, feeling publicly slighted and inconvenienced. However, the church's decision was final. Seraphina entered the convent, eventually taking her solemn vows and becoming a nun. Her life, though far different from the one her family had planned, was, for her, one of profound fulfillment and peace. The incident served as a potent reminder that even the most carefully laid plans of man could be superseded by the powerful and often unexpected call of God in the medieval world. Number 6. Childhood promise. Adult regrets. Breaking the cradle betrothal. In the medieval period, it was common practice, especially among noble and wealthy families, to arrange marriages for their children when they were still infants or very young. These cradle betrothals or childhood betrothals were strategic alliances designed to secure long-term peace, consolidate wealth, or establish powerful dynastic connections. The children involved had no say in the matter. Their futures were meticulously planned by their parents. However, canon law, the law of the church, recognized that for a marriage to be truly valid, it required the free consent of both parties. This meant that when the betrothed children reached the age of maturity, typically around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, they had a window of opportunity to object to the arranged union. If one or both parties genuinely repudiated the betrothal at that point, the wedding could be called off, freeing them from a promise made in their infancy. Consider the case of Lady Agnes of Salisbury and Sir Thomas of Warwickshire, a proposed marriage dating back to the mid-14th century. Their parents, powerful landowners, had arranged their betrothal when Agnes was 3 and Thomas was 5. The agreement had been sealed with lavish gifts and a grand feast, ensuring a future of shared influence and prosperity for their two houses. As they grew up, Agnes and Thomas were aware of their destiny, though they spent much of their childhood apart, being raised in their respective family homes. They would occasionally meet at family gatherings or jousting tournaments, but their interactions were largely formal and distant. As Agnes approached her 12th birthday, the age at which she could formally consent her object, a growing sense of unease settled upon her. Thomas, now a robust young man of 14, was, by all accounts, considered a good match, brave, dutiful, and heir to vast estates. But Agnes found him to be brusque, overly focused on hunting and martial pursuits, and lacking in the gentle conversation and intellectual curiosity she longed for. She had a keen mind, a love for illuminated manuscripts, and a desire for a partner who shared her interests beyond the mundane realities of estate management and warfare. She felt a profound sense of dread at the prospect of spending her life with a man with whom she had little in common beyond a childhood promise. Thomas, for his part, also felt a growing indifference, if not outright aversion to the match. He had developed an affection for a younger, more vivacious cousin, a girl who shared his passion for horses and outdoor pursuits, and who, he felt, truly understood him in a way Agnes, with her quiet demeanor, never could. He viewed the arranged marriage as a duty, a practical step, but harbored no personal attachment or desire for Agnes. He too recognized that the consent given for him in his infancy was not his own. As their respective maturity dates approached, both Agnes and Thomas independently began to express their reservations to their families. Agnes, though fearful of her father's wrath, tearfully explained her profound unhappiness with the match and her inability to envision a future of contentment with Thomas. Thomas, though more blunt, made it clear that he had no affection for Agnes and felt forced into a union that did not suit him. Both pleaded for the opportunity to withdraw their consent. Their parents, who had meticulously planned this union, were initially furious. They emphasized the broken promises, the social awkwardness, and the financial implications of dissolving such a long-standing betrothal. However, the Church's stance was clear. Genuine free consent at the age of maturity was a prerequisite for a valid marriage. If either party formally and publicly expressed a desire to repudiate the childhood betrothal, it could not proceed. After intense family discussions, and with the reluctant intervention of local ecclesiastical authorities who confirmed the canon law on the matter, both Agnes and Thomas formally declared their individual rejection of the betrothal before witnesses and a church official. They stated that the promise made on their behalf as children did not reflect their free will as adults. The wedding was called off, much to the chagrin of their parents, who had to absorb the social embarrassment and seek new, albeit less advantageous, matches for their children. Agnes and Thomas, however, found a measure of freedom, released from a childhood promise that had loomed over their lives, demonstrating that even in an age of arranged marriages, the individual's free consent, when expressed at maturity, held surprising power. Number 5. Shotgun wedding, medieval style. Forced vows and no takesies backsies. In the medieval era, while parental arrangement of marriages was common, genuine consent was in theory a crucial element for a valid marriage according to church law. A marriage entered into under duress or coercion, where one party was not truly free to say yes or no, could be declared null and void. This meant that if a person could prove they were forced into a betrothal or a wedding, perhaps by threats, violence, or imprisonment, they could seek an annulment, effectively calling off the marriage, even if it had already begun. Challenge, of course, lay in proving such coercion against powerful families or individuals who wished to maintain the union. But if the evidence was strong enough, it could undo even the most seemingly secure matrimonial bond. Consider the harrowing story of Lady Isabella of Kent, who in the early 15th century faced such a predicament. Isabella was the sole heiress to a vast and fertile estate in Kent. Her hand in marriage was coveted by many, including Sir Guy de Valois, a ruthless and ambitious knight from a lesser noble family who sought to expand his own limited holdings. Isabella's father, though powerful, had grown old and frail. Sir Guy, seeing an opportunity, began to exert immense pressure on the aging lord, subtly threatening his tenants and hinting at violence if the marriage was not agreed upon. When these tactics failed to yield the desired betrothal, Sir Guy resorted to more direct and terrifying measures. One dark night, Sir Guy, with a band of his armed retainers, stormed Isabella's family manor. They seized her father, imprisoning him in his own keep, and then presented Isabella with a stark ultimatum. Either she agreed to marry Sir Guy and sealed the betrothal immediately, or her father would face severe consequences, potentially even death, and her lands would be laid waste. Isabella, terrified for her ailing father's life and the safety of her household, and seeing no other recourse, outwardly consented. A forced, hurried betrothal ceremony was conducted with a frightened priest pressed into service. The wedding was then swiftly arranged for a few weeks later to solidify Sir Guy's claim over her and her inheritance. Despite the outward appearance of an agreement, Isabella was living under a terrifying shadow. She knew that her consent was not free, but coerced under duress. Once her father was released and Sir Guy had temporarily left to prepare for the wedding, Isabella, with the help of a loyal family chaplain, managed to send a desperate plea for help to her family's most powerful ally, a distant but influential duke. She recounted in detail the terrifying night, the threats, the imprisonment of her father, and the complete absence of free will in her agreement to the marriage. She provided testimonies from loyal servants who had witnessed the intimidation and violence. The Duke, appalled by Sir Guy's blatant disregard for canon law and noble conduct, took up Isabella's cause. He immediately petitioned the ecclesiastical courts, demanding an annulment of the betrothal on grounds of coercion. A full investigation was launched by the church. Witnesses were interviewed, including Isabella's father, who confirmed his imprisonment and the threats against his daughter. priest who had been forced to conduct the ceremony also provided a harrowing account of the intimidation he had faced. The evidence was overwhelming. Isabella had not given her free and uncoerced consent. Despite Sir Guy's furious protests and his attempts to deny the accusations, the church court, with the powerful backing of the Duke, ruled in Isabella's favor. The betrothal was declared null and void, as if it had never happened, on the grounds that her consent was obtained through force and fear. The wedding, which was only days away, was called off. Sir Guy, disgraced and facing the wrath of a powerful duke, was forced to retreat, his ambitions thwarted. Isabella, though traumatized by the experience, was free. Her story served as a stark example that even in an age of arranged marriages and powerful men, the principle of free consent, when demonstrably violated, could be a powerful legal tool to prevent an unwanted and invalid union. Number 4. When the marriage bed stays empty, the non-consummation nightmare. For the medieval church, the act of marriage was not merely a formal exchange of vows. It was also the joining of two individuals in body and spirit, meant to be cemented by sexual union, known as consummation. This act, in the eyes of canon law, was what truly perfected the marriage, especially for the purpose of procreation and the continuation of lineage. If a marriage, for whatever reason, could not be consummated, it was deemed invalid and could be annulled. The inability or refusal of one of the spouses to perform the marital act was a valid ground for annulment, leading to the cancellation of the union. This often led to incredibly intrusive and embarrassing inquiries, as church officials would need to investigate the most private aspects of a couple's life to determine if consummation had indeed occurred. Perhaps the most famous and politically charged instance of this principle in action involved King Henry VIII of England and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, though their annulment process was incredibly complex and spanned many years, ultimately leading to England's break from the Roman Catholic Church. While their union had been established for a long time, Henry's main argument for annulment revolved around the idea that their marriage was invalid from the beginning due to a lack of consummation in Catherine's first marriage to Henry's older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. Catherine of Aragon was initially married to Arthur, Henry VII's eldest son and heir, in 1501. The marriage was a crucial alliance between England and Spain. However, Arthur died suddenly, only a few months after the wedding. To maintain the alliance, and to avoid returning Catherine's substantial dowry, a special papal dispensation was obtained, allowing Catherine to marry Henry, Arthur's younger brother. Premise for this dispensation was that Catherine's marriage to Arthur had not been consummated. If it had been, then, according to Levitical law, marrying a brother's wife was forbidden, rendering the second marriage incestuous and invalid. When Henry VIII later desired to annul his marriage to Catherine, primarily because she had failed to produce a male heir and he had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, he resurrected this very old argument. He claimed that the papal dispensation was invalid because Catherine and Arthur had indeed consummated their marriage. Catherine, however, steadfastly denied this, maintaining until her death that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, and she arrived at Henry's bed a virgin. This became the central, excruciatingly personal, and ultimately unresolvable point of contention in what became known as the King's Great Matter. Process involved extensive inquiries into the most intimate details of Catherine's past. Witnesses, including former servants from Arthur's household, were called to testify on the matter of the consummation of the first marriage. Their testimonies often involved graphic details and personal observations about Arthur and Catherine's shared bedchamber. The debate centered on whether Arthur and Catherine in their short time together had truly engaged in sexual relations. Henry's supporters argued that Arthur had openly boasted of being in Spain, a crude reference to consummation, while Catherine's defenders maintained that both were young, sickly, and that the marriage had remained unconsummated. The very future of the English crown, The legitimacy of Henry's subsequent children and the relationship between England and Rome hinged on this deeply private question. Ultimately, Henry failed to obtain an annulment from the Pope based on this argument, largely because Catherine maintained her version of events and papal authority was unwilling to contradict its own previous dispensation. However, his relentless pursuit of this annulment, rooted in the legal principle of non-consummation of the first marriage, forced him to eventually break away from the authority of the Pope and establish the Church of England, allowing him to declare his marriage to Catherine invalid and thus call off a union that had lasted over 2 decades. The long and painful ordeal of Henry and Catherine serves as the most spectacular and ultimately revolutionary example of how the medieval concept of consummation could be used to undo a marriage, leading to unforeseen consequences for an entire nation. Number 3. The ghost of boyfriends past. Pre-contract problems. In medieval canon law, a betrothal was a far more serious and legally binding agreement than a modern engagement. It was considered a pre-contract, a solemn promise of marriage that could, under certain circumstances, be almost as binding as the marriage itself. If one party had made a prior formal betrothal to someone else, and that pre-contract was still valid and unfulfilled, any subsequent betrothal or marriage they entered into could be deemed invalid. The discovery of such a ghost of boyfriend's past or girlfriend's past could immediately halt a wedding, as the Church upheld the sanctity of the first promise made. This required careful investigation into the background of prospective spouses, as a secret prior commitment could unravel everything. Consider the intricate case from the early 14th century involving the proposed marriage between Lord Edmund of Cornwall and Lady Isabella of Devon. Their union was highly anticipated, meant to unite vast estates and significant political influence in the southwest of England. The negotiations had been extensive, the dowry settled, and the wedding date was set for a grand ceremony in the summer. Both families were eager for the alliance, which promised mutual prosperity and a formidable power block. However, as the wedding approached, a troublesome rumor began to circulate through the local parishes. It concerned Lord Edmund's youth, specifically a period he had spent serving a minor lord in a distant shire years prior. It was whispered that during that time he had formally betrothed himself to a young woman of lesser standing, a local merchant's daughter named Eleanor. This was not merely a casual promise. Medieval betrothals could be formed by spoken words of present consent, even without witnesses if both parties genuinely intended marriage. But often, they were made more formally before a priest or witnesses. The rumor suggested a formal, binding exchange of vows between Edmund and Eleanor. Initially, Lord Edmund dismissed these claims as malicious gossip, attempt by rivals to derail his advantageous marriage to Lady Isabella. His family, equally dismissive, tried to suppress the rumors. However, the whispers persisted, growing louder and more specific. It was claimed that Eleanor was still alive, unmarried, and considered herself to be formally betrothed to Edmund, having never been released from the promise. If true, this prior contract would render his current betrothal to Isabella invalid in the eyes of the Church. The prospect of bigamy, even if unintended, was a grave offense, and a marriage based on a prior unfulfilled contract would be null. Lady Isabella's family, concerned by the persistent nature of the rumors, decided to launch a quiet but thorough investigation. They dispatched trusted agents to the distant shire where Edmund had served. What they uncovered was deeply unsettling. They found Eleanor, now a respectable woman, who indeed maintained that she had exchanged formal betrothal vows with Edmund years ago. She produced a small engraved silver token that Edmund had given her as a pledge. More crucially, her testimony was corroborated by several local residents, including a retired parish priest who confirmed that Edmund and Eleanor had indeed exchanged formal vows of present consent. Before him, albeit quietly and without much fanfare, priest remembered the occasion clearly, recalling their earnest words and intentions. He explained that, at the time, Edmund had indicated he would return for her, but he never did. The fact that Alara had never subsequently married was also seen as supporting evidence of her belief in the enduring nature of their prior contract. The evidence was undeniable. Lord Edmund had indeed made a legally binding pre-contract to Alara, which had never been formally dissolved or annulled. This meant his current betrothal to Lady Isabella was invalid from its very inception. The discovery created a crisis for both families. Lord Edmund, while denying malicious intent, could not deny the evidence. Lady Isabella's family, fiercely protective of their daughter's honor and legitimacy, would not proceed with a marriage that was tainted by such a serious impediment. The wedding was called off. Pre-contract with Alara had to be formally annulled by church authorities before Edmund could even contemplate another marriage, a process that was both embarrassing and time-consuming. The ghost of Edmund's past had returned to haunt his future, proving that in medieval society, a promise made even years ago and seemingly forgotten could have profound consequences. Number 2. The oops, we're cousins. Annulment, when you're too closely related. One of the most frequent and complex reasons for calling off a medieval wedding or seeking an annulment after the fact was the discovery of too close a blood relationship between the betrothed parties. The medieval church had incredibly strict and expansive rules about consanguinity, or kinship by blood, and affinity, or kinship by marriage. These rules extended surprisingly far, sometimes up to the 7th degree of kinship, meaning that if you shared a great-great-great-great-grandparent, you might be too closely related to marry. Marriages between people within these forbidden degrees were considered incestuous and invalid in the eyes of God and canon law. Discovering such a connection, often through meticulous genealogical research or the sudden revelation of a hidden family tree branch, could bring a grand wedding to a screeching halt. Prime example of this complex issue, which also ties into the non-consummation problem, is once again the long and drawn-out annulment process of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. While Henry's main argument against their marriage eventually became non-consummation of Catherine's first marriage, the initial premise for even needing a papal dispensation for Henry and Catherine's union at all was due to their kinship. Catherine was the widow of Henry's elder brother Arthur. According to Levitical law, marrying a brother's wife was forbidden. This was considered a case of affinity, a relationship created through marriage. Henry's father, King Henry VII, had to obtain a special dispensation from Pope Julius II to allow his son Henry to marry Catherine, precisely because of this impediment of affinity. The dispensation explicitly stated that it permitted the marriage even if Catherine's first marriage had been consummated, though Catherine always maintained it had not been. Later, when King Henry VIII sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, his primary argument against the validity of their marriage was based on the belief that the original papal dispensation was invalid because it contradicted divine law, specifically the biblical prohibition against mated. He argued that the Pope could not dispense with divine law. This argument, while focused on the consummation aspect of the first marriage, was fundamentally rooted in the concept of forbidden degrees of kinship, specifically affinity. Henry essentially argued that his marriage to Catherine was an incestuous union in God's eyes, and therefore it had never been valid from the start. This principle of consanguinity and affinity caused endless headaches and legal battles for medieval nobles. Families often needed to trace their lineages back many generations, sometimes across multiple countries, to ensure no hidden connections existed. It was not uncommon for long-forgotten branches of a family tree to suddenly resurface, revealing a forbidden degree of kinship that would derail a marriage. For example, less famous but equally illustrative was the case of Lady Eleanor de Burgh and Sir Geoffrey Fitzalan in 13th century England. Their families, though prominent, were not royal. Their wedding plans were well advanced when a diligent family genealogist, researching the de Burgh lineage, discovered a shared ancestor in the 5th degree of kinship, a relatively obscure baron who had lived 2 centuries prior. This meant that Eleanor and Geoffrey were distant cousins. Under contemporary canon law, marriage within the fifth degree of consanguinity was forbidden without a special dispensation from the Pope. While such dispensations could be obtained, they were costly, time-consuming, and not always guaranteed. The families, fearing a lengthy legal battle and the risk of a void marriage, decided it was safer and more pragmatic to call off the union. The revelation of this distant, almost forgotten shared ancestor meant that the oops, we're cousins realization was enough to prevent the wedding from ever taking place, highlighting how meticulously the church scrutinized family trees and how easily a marriage could be deemed invalid due to unforeseen familial connections, demonstrating the profound reach of medieval kinship laws into the intimate lives of its people. Number 1. The bigamy bombshell. Uncovering a secret spouse. Perhaps the most shocking and undeniable reason for calling off a medieval wedding was the discovery that one of the betrothed parties was already legally married to someone else. In an age where marriage was a sacrament and a legal contract, bigamy was considered a grave offense against both God and the law. A person could only have one spouse at a time. If it came to light that a prospective bride or groom already had a living undivorced spouse, the impending wedding would be instantly and irrevocably canceled. This revelation would lead to immediate legal action, social disgrace, and potentially severe penalties for the bigamist, making it impossible for the second illegal union to proceed. Consider the sensational events surrounding Sir Richard of Hereford in the late 14th century. Sir Richard was a knight of modest means, but considerable charm and ambition. He had managed to secure a betrothal to Lady Catherine, the wealthy and well-connected daughter of a powerful baron in the northern marches. The match promised to elevate Sir Richard's status and fortune significantly, bringing him vast lands and political influence. The wedding was to be a grand affair, and preparations were in full swing, with Lady Catherine's family eagerly anticipating the union. Sir Richard had presented himself as a bachelor, eager to start a new life with his future bride. However, just weeks before the lavish wedding ceremony, a lone travel-worn woman arrived at the baron's gates, demanding to speak with Lady Catherine's father. She presented herself as Eleanor, and her story was a bombshell. She claimed to be Sir Richard's lawful wife. She had traveled a great distance from a remote village in the west, having heard rumors of Sir Richard's impending marriage, and driven by desperation and a desperate desire for justice. She produced a marriage certificate, formally attested by a parish priest, proving her union to Sir Richard from years ago. She explained that Sir Richard had abandoned her years earlier, leaving her destitute, and she had presumed him dead or simply lost to her until she heard of his new grand engagement. She provided details of their life together, their wedding, and even small intimate facts that only a true spouse would know. The baron was initially incredulous, then furious. He had vouched for Sir Richard, believing him to be an honorable bachelor. He immediately confronted Sir Richard with the accusations and the evidence. Sir Richard, trapped and cornered, initially attempted to deny the claims, dismissing Eleanor as a madwoman or an opportunist seeking to extort money. However, Eleanor's detailed testimony, corroborated by her official marriage papers and the undeniable truth in her story, quickly broke down his lies. Further investigation by the baron's men confirmed Eleanor's identity and the validity of her marriage to Sir Richard. They even located the priest who had performed the ceremony years ago, who confirmed the union. The revelation sent shockwaves through the baronial household and the wider community. Sir Richard was a bigamist, a criminal, and a deceiver. His intended marriage to Lady Catherine was, by definition, utterly invalid and illegal. The shame and scandal for Lady Catherine and her family were immense. They had been on the verge of entering into a bigamous union with a man who had flagrantly violated both church law and civil law. The wedding was called off immediately, without any hesitation. Sir Richard was promptly arrested and faced severe penalties for bigamy, which could include public humiliation, imprisonment, or even execution. Lady Catherine, though heartbroken and humiliated, was spared a lifetime bound to a deceitful man and an invalid marriage. The bigamy bombshell was the ultimate unmasking, proving that even the most elaborate deceptions could not stand against the immutable laws of medieval marriage, and ensuring that no second union could ever truly begin.